Thank you. Thank you. Tack. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here in Denmark. It's not my first time. Can you hear me all right at the back? Yeah, I'm from the Midlands in England, right in the middle, and near Birmingham. And I've been living there since the 1980s. Before that I was in London. Before that I was in Tokyo. And my background is in history. I studied history at the University of Manchester in England. I have a degree from there. And then I went to Japan at the age of 21 and spent 7 years in Japan, which is where I met my wife, following a year after I arrived. And I'm happy to say that 7 days ago, I became a grandfather for the first time. So as you can appreciate, I have an interest, a very personal one, you might say, in the future. But also I have an interest, obviously, because of my destiny in East-West relations. And I spent another 3.5 years in Japan in the early 90s. So altogether 10.5 years in Japan. So languages and history is my field. And I basically do 3 jobs, so to speak, three things since 2005 when I became freelance. I'm a translator of Japanese and German, and I also write and speak about current events and history. You can find some of my talks online, and I've published these 2 books. The first one, Behind the Plans of the New World Order, is already out of date. Sorry, out of print, I should say. Some parts of it may be out of date. It probably needs an update, but I think it's still pretty relevant in many respects. So, but I'm intending to put that online as a download on my new website, which is there, later this year, before Christmas, I hope. And then the other one, Caspar Hauser, Where Did He Come From? That's 2006. So today, my talk is going to be in 2 parts. The first part will be easier for you because there'll be pictures. So you can dream a little bit into the pictures because they're given to you. But the second part, I'm afraid, I'm going to have to ask you to work a little bit harder because there will be no pictures. No pictures. So you're going to have to make your own pictures. You're going to have to imagine. So a little bit more challenging in the second half. I'll try and keep it lively while I speak. But I will be relying on you to work, especially in the second part. Now, what I want to talk about today is these 3 boring words: materialism, consciousness, and development. 3 abstract words. And before I go any further, I must remember that I want to thank you, actually all of you, because I have spent, as I've said, 10.5 years in Japan, and my field is language, so I know what it's like to work to understand a foreign language. Many of you speak excellent English, but because most of you are not native speakers of English, that means that even if your English is 95% good, you're still working that little bit harder than a native speaker. And I appreciate that, and I want to thank you for it. So thank you very much for allowing me to speak in my own language. Yeah?
Just help me, because we can a little bit pressure on it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Right. So. Okay. So before I go into speaking about these 3 abstract concepts and what they have to do with our story as human beings, the story of each one of us, I'd like to give a very direct, individual example, just for a short period, of these 3 things, to make it very concrete. This is Stefan Aust. He's the managing director, or the editor, of Der Spiegel magazine in Germany. I think it's Europe's largest weekly magazine. And you may remember that Lars referred to him the other day. because, indirectly as it were, because he showed us that film, a clip of the Baader-Meinhof complex, and it talked about the origins of terrorism. Well, the man who wrote the book, the Baader-Meinhof complex, is this man, Stefan Aust. And he has a particular take on things, and both he and the man who was the editor before him, Augstein, we need to know that they're very much connected with the British occupation authorities when the Spiegel really got going in the occupation period after the war. Now, in the 1990s, this man did something very particular. A film was produced in 1993 in Germany called Kaspar Hauser, The Man, the Myth, the Crime. And this film won many German film awards in 1993. And at the end of this film, when this character, Kaspar Hauser, dies, you see these words written in German. I'll translate. In 1993, 160 years after Kaspar Hauser's death, the House of Baden keeps its documents still under lock and key, so to speak, and shrouds itself in silence. So it doesn't say anything about this case. Now, that was at the very end of the film. That was the last thing which the people saw. So these words pointed a big finger in the direction of the House of Baden. The House of Baden is still headed by a living person who is still there in Germany. He's one of the richest people in Germany and one of the richest wine growers in Germany. And then, 3 years later, 1996, Mr. Aust gathered together the press corps, all the press from Germany, and he brought them together in this place you see at the top. And this is the place where this character, Kaspar Hauser, was murdered in 1833. And it's really nice. It's really, Ian Crane's given me a really good connection here, because if you remember, Ian referred to the price of gold from 1833 to 1918. He said the price of gold was stable in that period. Those two dates are very important in what I'm going to be saying today. So Kaspar Hauser was murdered in December 1833. And Mr. Aust brought the journalists of Germany together in this garden where Kaspar Hauser was killed. And it had been thought that, the circumstances of his death and his life were very mysterious. And Mr. Aust announced that really this whole story of Kaspar Hauser was a myth and a nonsense which the German people really should stop thinking about, because DNA test had revealed that this individual had nothing to do with this House of Baden. In other words, he was not this Prince of House of Baden. Now, I'm not going to go into this whole story. It's very complicated. But there are certain things which are directly related to our theme today. Here there are two scientists who they got to do the DNA test. One of them was British government scientist working for the British government at the University of Birmingham, near where I live. But here, I draw your attention to this triangle where it says Agent Mouse indicates the story of the German 007. So down here, this has nothing to do, by the way, with the picture. At least it seems like that. But here you have a reference to a British secret agent. Agent Mouse is a German equivalent of James Bond, you might say, a popular German TV show. So here's a reference to James Bond. Here's a British scientist who was involved in this. And here you see Kaspar Hauser and his gravestone. And it says, genetics researchers solve a century-old riddle. So Aust's conclusion was, well, this story is a nonsense because genetics researchers have proven that there is no connection between this individual, Kaspar Hauser, and the House of Baden. So let's forget all about it. This individual was born 200 years ago on the 29th of September, and as I say, was murdered in 1833 at the age of 21. And he was referred to as the child of Europe during the 5 years that he was in front of the public, because in the rest of his life, he was in prison, and nobody knew where he was. And the question was, after he was released in Nuremberg, is he related, or is he in fact the son of Grand Duke Karl of Baden? There you see the picture. You can judge for yourself whether there is any family, whether there's any facial resemblance. And this was supposed to be his mother, Stephanie of Baden, the daughter of Napoleon, Napoleon's adopted daughter. So these are supposed to be the parents of this individual, Caspar Hauser. And then he turns up in Nuremberg on this date, aged about 15, supposedly looking like this, carrying a letter. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the point is, he could hardly walk. He couldn't speak except one sentence. And that sentence was, "I want to be a rider like my father was." And he repeated that over and over. He seemed to have a mental age of about 4. And they didn't know what to do with him. So eventually they handed him over to a teacher who tried to then teach him how to become a normal human being, so to speak. And doctors investigated him, and they found that his bones were deformed in such a way that it was clear that he had not been walking, that he had been somehow physically constrained, physically perhaps tied to something so that he could not stand up properly and walk for a long time. And he would only eat bread and drink water. So people couldn't understand this. It was a challenge to their consciousness that this person could be in this condition. Somebody suspected that because there had been a famous case of a child who had been found in the forest, and maybe had been brought up by animals or something like that, they thought, well, maybe this is the case here too. But no, it became clear over time that in fact a crime had been committed, and this boy had been kept in prison for a long time. So the question is, who did that and why? And eventually this, due to the efforts of this teacher, Caspar Hauser was able to become a more accomplished young man in just 5 years, quite remarkable, when he had only the mental age of about a 4-year-old when he first appeared. Physically aged about 15, mental age about 4. By the time he was killed, he was a reasonably accomplished young man. But the thing that people noticed about him was that he had a remarkably pure soul. He seemed to be an incredibly innocent person. He seemed to make people ashamed when they were in his presence, because he seemed to be something from very ancient times. Some people said from another planet. Some people said an angel. Some people said from Eden. Some people said from before the beginning of the world. He seemed to have these very special qualities about him, and he also had very special capacities, like he could see in the dark, he could sense people without seeing them physically, he could sense metals without seeing them physically, he knew what they were, all sorts of things. Again, I haven't got time to go into all of that. But he clearly had some remarkable capacities which normal people do not have. Gradually, he lost those capacities, but as he lived in the world. But at the same time, he began to remember things that had happened to him. And what it became clear was that somebody who helped him, one of the famous criminologists who helped him, discovered in the end that this woman, there are 2 Lady Macbeths in this story. This woman at the top, Countess Louisa von Hochberg, her real name is Countess Louisa Geier von Geiersberg. Geier in German means, does anybody know? Vulture. Lady Louisa Vulture of Vulture Mountain. It's often interesting to pay attention to names and such phenomena in history, yes? Anyway, she was related to this family, and she basically abducted this baby, this child, when he was only 3 weeks old, and removed him so that eventually her own son here, Leopold, could become the Grand Duke of Baden. And then Leopold eventually marries Princess Sophie of Sweden, and they become the ruling family. So we have an abduction by a woman who wants power for her own bloodline. And then later on in the story, a British spy, a secret agent, Lord Stanhope, enters in. He's working indirectly for Vienna, Metternich, who governs or controls Europe in a certain sense at that time, indirectly, the most powerful man in Europe, arguably, at that time. This is Gentz, who is basically the go-between, Metternich's secretary between these two. And then the point was that these two guys did not want Caspar Hauser's mother, Napoleon's adopted niece, to have power in Europe through her real son, Caspar Hauser. So they used this British agent to draw Caspar Hauser away from his friends, and then when they put him in a situation where he was isolated from his friends and protectors, away from Nuremberg, eventually he was killed. Another picture of Lord Stanhope. Long-line British aristocracy. This is the murder weapon, which was later found, which killed Caspar Hauser, found in the park. You see a skull and crossbones design, you see an hourglass, and you see a Freemasonic Tau cross on top of that. And also, when he was killed, he was given a pouch. And when he was looking in this pouch, he was told there would be something from his mother in there, and he opened it to look in. There was a message. Later it was found. The message was written in Spiegelschrift, mirror writing. And then he was killed while he was trying to see what this was. Stabbed fatally. He died 3 days later. So, as I said, 1996, Mr. Aust puts this out there, the press, the media. It goes online. Caspar Hauser was a fraud. It was all a lie. It's all a load of nonsense. But then in 2002, people who did not believe that these underpants with this blood stain, which is supposedly what they had tested in the DNA test, people who did not believe that is real, they questioned, well, maybe the underpants didn't come from Caspar Hauser, so it doesn't matter if you've done an accurate DNA test if the blood is not his and the pants are not his. The question is, the pants are not his. Are they or not? So another DNA test was done. And again, without going into all details, you can check this all out online, and I've written various articles about it on my website. You'll find that another DNA test was done by this professor, another university in Germany, and he found there was, in fact, a 95% match, DNA match, which apparently, I am told, I'm not an expert in this field, this is good enough. So then the question was opened again, well, maybe he was, in fact, descended from the House of Boardman, and this professor says, scientifically, there's no reason to think he was not a descendant of this house. Well, why is this important? This is the place where he was abducted to when he was very young. He was then transferred to another prison later on. And when he began to remember details from his early life, that was one of the things that gave the clue to help the criminologist to solve the mystery and to realize that it was the vulture lady, the Countess von Hochberg, who had abducted him. Let's just remember what's going on in Europe at this time. In my country, in England, the Industrial Revolution had started 1 hour's drive away from where I live, in the Midlands. Children were working underground 12, 16 hours a day. That was what was going on in Europe. It was not really happening in Germany or in Europe, on the continent much yet. But in Britain, this was really steaming along, the Industrial Revolution by this time, since the 1770s already. So society was being transformed. Just a question, did anybody see the London Olympics on television? Yeah, could I just have a show of hands? Thank you. Okay, so if you saw the opening ceremony, then you probably remember this so-called transformation of this wonderful ancient time of harmony and happiness, you know, frankly, largely illusory, largely an illusion, but nevertheless, some truth to it. And that was transformed into this. we saw at the Olympics. And this was what's happening in Britain at the time. And then on the continent, this was happening. Napoleon was happening. Just look at the contrast again between these two images. West. Asia. This, ladies and gentlemen, I would submit to you, is not France. This is Asia. What we're looking at when we look at that is the whole history of Europe going back through the Greeks, right through to Babylon, Persia, India. This is what Napoleon was trying to recreate in Europe in the 18th, 19th century. An ancient style of Roman and pre-Roman monarchy. Whereas in Britain, something completely new was taking place. A change in consciousness, you could say, had taken place, which was, on the one hand, scientifically and technologically revolutionary, radical, but on the human and moral scale was fundamentally inhuman in many respects. People seem to have lost their feeling for what it means to be a human being. So children were in these conditions. At the same time, Caspar Hauser was apparently, it was discovered, he too had been kept in the dark for at least about 11 years or so. Excuse me, having problems with this. This is how Europe looked at that time. You see that basically Europe was dominated by France. All of this is really controlled by France or French allies. Denmark was France's ally at that time, not willingly, of course. So there was the attempt to make Europe one, uniform, under French control. But if we just go back a minute, before the French Revolution, Europe looked like this. Just have a look at that. Look at the West. Solid, compact, unitary, tightly disciplined, relatively, from central capitals, strong government. And look at the East. Huge, vast, expansive territories, weak government, little administration, difficult to control people. And you see these different compact shapes and forms in the West, and these huge spaces in the East. And then look at the middle here, Scandinavia, Germany. Yeah? Fluid, changing. Now look at this here. Oh, can I? Is it possible? It is. You see this design here? This is basically a caduceus. This is a Mercury design. You have the two curves surrounding the vertical in the middle. This vertical, in this case, is not fixed. It is itself fluid, but basically you have a polarity. In this period of time in European history and culture revealed quite very, very directly and powerfully, clearly, a threefold entity, that Europe as a culture and civilization is a threefold entity. Behind the scenes of this threefold entity, behind Napoleon fighting the English and the Russians and so on, you had hidden powers, the Freemasons, the Jesuits. At that time, the Freemasons were split, the Jesuits were in fact abolished. Then they came back again after the fall of Napoleon, and when they were abolished, they fled to Russia and Prussia in particular, where they taught many people. The kings of those countries encouraged them to go there. Napoleon was fighting Russia. West had gone across to attack the East. What's changed? We're now in a similar situation, are we not? We're waiting. Everybody's waiting with bated breath for when the Americans and the Israelis are going to attack Iran. Another attack on the East from the West. Here's Napoleon in Russia waiting for the Tsar to negotiate with him. This was the situation when Caspar Hauser was born and Michaelmas 1812. Then, after Caspar Hauser was murdered, we have the 1848 revolutions in Germany. And you have the Frankfurt Parliament, where the revolutions are taking place all over Europe. And in Germany, the revolution began in Baden, where Caspar Hauser was from, and it ended in Baden. And it was destroyed, it was crushed in Baden by the Prussians, the Prussian army. Because Baden was the most liberal and progressive part of Germany at that time. And the revolutionaries wanted a constitutional monarchy in Germany at that time. But they couldn't agree, they couldn't find a way forward. And in the end, the conservatives gained the upper hand outside the Frankfurt Parliament, and as I say, the revolution was crushed. In other words, somebody was missing from this scenario. They were missing, as it were, somebody who could have become the king of this united Germany. Somebody who would have not been like the King of Prussia. Somebody who had a moral sense. Somebody who was a good human being. But that person had already been removed from the scene in 1833, ahead of time, by forces working behind the scenes. And this, in a sense, this image of Neuschwanstein by Ludwig II, the tragic king of Bavaria, is in a certain sense, I will suggest to you, what Germany should have become. Not a fairyland, but a land which was looking to the spirit and looking to culture, to be a center of culture in Europe. But unfortunately, Ludwig was not really the man to do it. What it should have become. The person who it could have been could have collaborated with these two geniuses. Now, I'm quite aware that this is Denmark, so in Denmark, Otto von Bismarck does not have a good press. Yeah? But the point is, he was an effective man of will, but a one-sided, very one-sided individual, will and power. And Lassalle, here in the middle, Jewish leader of German Workers' Party, a man of the heart, a man of passion, a romantic. So what does he do? He gets himself killed in a duel over a woman. So he's out of the picture. The man who could have brought the bourgeoisie, the middle classes, and the working classes together. The cultural, spiritual, political leader is out of the picture because in Caspar Hauser's case, he's dead. Ludwig II was killed by his own relatives because he was spending too much money, they thought. That's a joke because, of course, today the Bavarian state is earning loads of money from the castles he built. Anyway, but Germany was left with Otto von Bismarck, the man of blood and iron, and we know the rest. Now, I said that Ian gave me a kind of a handover, so to speak, yeah? 1833 to 1918. Because in 1918, at the end of the First World War, this man was the last imperial chancellor of Germany, and this man was the man who closed down the German Empire in the short period he was the chancellor and handed over to the Republic and surrendered on the basis of the Woodrow Wilson's 14 points at the end of the First World War. So in other words, Central Europe accepted what the West said to it. Now, why was this man the Chancellor of Germany? Why had he got in this position? Because his ancestor had abducted the rightful head of the House of Baden. So he was there because of an act of a crime, which his ancestor had committed. Look at his dates. He was Chancellor from the 3rd of October to the 9th of November. 3rd of October, does that mean anything to you? Anybody recognize that date at all? I wouldn't expect you would. No, it's actually German Reunification Day. It's the day when Germany came back together again in 1990, and it is German National Day now. And how about the 9th of November? Another 9/11. How about that? 9/11, anybody? 9th of November? Kristallnacht, 1938, yes? Anything else? Sorry? Somebody's birthday. Whose? Ah, okay. But it's also the date of Hitler's attempted coup in Munich in 1923. And then, of course, in 9/11, 1989, was the Berlin Wall. So this is a peculiar, special date in 20th century German history. Those are the two dates of this man. And then, of course, as a result of what then happens in the First World War, when Germany is fighting in the First World War for nothing more than its own survival, it's not standing for anything. It's not standing for any values that it can really represent to the world. It's just standing for what it sees to be survival against the forces attacking it. That's what they said about themselves. The result of the First World War, of course, is eventually Hitler. And we see here, you recognize the place? What city are we in? No. The Nazi party rallies. What city is this? Nuremberg. This is the city where Caspar Hauser was imprisoned, or just outside. And then when he was released, he spent those 3.5 of those 5 years in public in Nuremberg. So he's most associated with Nuremberg. And then, of course, this is then the result of what happened to Nuremberg in 1945 by the British Air Force, almost completely destroyed. And then in 1919, the Austrian spiritual scientist Rudolf Steiner, who had actually met Max von Baden a year before and tried to convince him to end the war on a different basis than Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. He tried to put some ideas to Max von Baden to end the war on a different footing, according to different conditions, to bring forward ideas which could help Germany and Europe after the war. Max von Baden didn't do that in the end. He decided not to. And Steiner made this comment a year later. The Anglo-American element may well achieve world dominion, but without the threefolding of society, this dominion will flood the world with the death of culture and the sickness of culture. And I think we can see what's happened since then, that in many respects that is the case. That is what has happened. Today, this is how the English-speaking world looks at the German-speaking world. As an engine, nothing more. Footballers and Mercedes-Benz and BMW. That's all we want from Central Europe, thank you very much. That's the attitude of the British elite who stand behind the Economist, which is very closely tied to the New World Order forces, which Ian will talk about later on. Yeah? And interestingly, on the back of this issue of the Economist, who do we find? Our old friend James Bond, here on holiday in the Bahamas, enjoying his retirement, advertising Louis Vuitton. And then we recall 007 and Lord Stanhope, the British secret agent, moving in the background to this affair of Caspar Hauser. Now, just before I finish this section, just leave you with a few quotes as to where this is going. It's about what kind of consciousness is going to be speaking in Europe to determine the future of Europe in the coming decades. You may not know the name W.T. Stead. 100 years ago, he was a very famous British journalist, socially progressive, but very imperialistic, and very much connected with the British elite of that time. And in 1899, as you see, he wrote a book called The United States of Europe on the Parliament of Peace. Now, we've seen what's happened this year. We're seeing how Europe is being forced towards fiscal integration, as they call it, which is but the last most important step, in a certain sense, of the completion of the European United States of Europe. And in this book, he wrote that he wrote about the importance of the unified Europe from the point of view of British interests. Now, this is not something that the British media talk about. That behind this whole push towards the united Europe is not something coming from Nazi Germany, is not something coming from the Catholic Church, but is actually, for 100 years now, been something coming from Britain, the English-speaking world. And Stead wrote, "What is England's mission abroad?" And he answered his own question. To maintain the European concert, which is that germ of the United States of Europe. He means like the Congress of Vienna, 1815, where the leaders get together and decide the fate of European millions. To maintain the European concert against isolated action. To establish a Roman peace among the dark-skinned races of Asia. To unite all branches of the English-speaking race in an Anglo-Saxon federation. So that the English-speaking peoples would in fact be one. Well, that's already happened. Because today, for example, the English-speaking military, Australia, Canada, America, Britain, New Zealand, they function as one unit. They use the same equipment, they use their equipment is compatible, they share intelligence, which they don't share with anybody else in NATO. They operate through the American spy systems, satellite systems, and so on. And to spread, of course, liberty, civilization, and Christianity throughout the world. This is the cover, yeah, the velvet glove over the iron fist. Averell Harriman, the American mid-century, 20th century statesman, often traveling to the Soviet Union, he said, "Our whole concept of the unification of Europe was that it would first contribute to economic reunification, then we hoped to secure an economic military unity, and finally, a political unity." He's describing something which the Anglo-American elite were thinking about for 100 years. Winston Churchill, 1947 in London. "We do not, of course, pretend that united Europe provides the final and complete solution to all the problems of international relationships. The creation of an authoritative, all-powerful world order is the ultimate aim towards which we must strive. Unless some effective world supergovernment can be set up and brought quickly into action, the prospects for peace and human progress are dark and doubtful. But let there be no mistake about the main issue. Without a united Europe, there is no sure prospect of world government. It is the urgent and indispensable step. Indispensable. We must have this. It's the indispensable step towards the realization of that ideal. After the First War, the League of Nations tried to build, without the aid of the USA, an international order upon a weak, divided Europe. Its failure cost us dear. So they did it again with the United Nations and succeeded to a large extent. So here we have an attempt to create a European monolith, the United States of Europe, driven by elites working from behind the curtain. This is not shared with the peoples of Europe through the media of Europe at that time. Certainly not in my country. I don't know about yours, in the 1950s and 1960s. Finally, from the Catholic side, Count Richard Coudenhove-Caligari, whose aristocratic bloodline goes back many centuries and is very complicated. He said in 1947, his organization founded the Council of Europe. He said, "At the heart of Europe, we met in Switzerland, we met in open conspiracy," to use the words of H.G. Wells, the British science fiction novelist. "The purpose of this conspiracy is to organize immediately across Europe the parliamentary majorities that would be strong and stable enough to impose upon governments the full implementation of our program, the European Union within the framework of the UN." So you see, Europe's tragedy at the moment has a lot to do with the tragedy of Germany, with how Germany went wrong in the middle of the 19th century. And why did that happen? It happened for two reasons. Because when you catch a cold, you catch it from two directions. There is the virus, which comes to you from the outside, so to speak. But you catch that virus because you have done something to yourself. You have weakened your own immune system in a certain way. Yeah? It's a twofold process. And this is what happened to Germany. that the Germans failed in the middle of the 19th century, after 1848, they failed to concentrate on what they, in a certain sense, ought to have done for Europe, which is, as I've said, is to become a cultural center, a bridge between East and West, North and South, a healing imagination role, a mercurial role. And instead they chose to copy the French and the British, which is the Mars path, seeking to compete with the West, France and Britain, the path of power. That Britain would not tolerate. And that led to the First World War and the whole tragedy that then unfolded in Europe, and which we are all a part of, and which we are now seeing the next phase of developing before our eyes. Because what is happening with this European Union development is, in a certain sense, another development of what Napoleon was bringing forward, one monolithic entity in Europe. But the story of Caspar is not only something that has to do with different ways of thinking about the future of Europe. It's not only a political issue, so to speak. It's also a question which makes us think about the nature of evil. Because unlike Napoleon, who did everything, he was a man of action, constantly active, Caspar, in a certain sense, did nothing. We know of him through what happened to him. And a lot of what happened to him were different manifestations of evil. And the question came up the other day in one of the other talks, who are they? Yeah? The they who's doing all these things to us with the chemtrails and the electronic mind control and all the rest of it that we all know about, yeah? Who are they? And that begs the question, what are the forces of evil? What is evil in the world, in our lives? What is its role? Some people think it's, even today, after everything that's happened since 9/11, some people still think it doesn't exist. Even after 1945 and the bombs and the Holocaust, they still ask that question. But Caspar was attacked in these 4 different ways. He was imprisoned, and that was an attack on his life forces, kept in the dark for about 11, 12 years. He was attacked in his feeling life through the British secret agent, Lord Stanhope, who seduced him with gifts and money and presents and friendship, false friendship. And money came into that. The banker, Haber, who was in Karlsruhe financing Lord Stanhope, who was the lover of Princess Sophie. This banker was her lover. Caspar was attacked by Princess Sophie, who finally gave the order to murder him. So she was the second Lady Macbeth. Hennenhofer was her official who arranged the murder gang. So assault and murder on the physical body. And then finally he was attacked in his very identity, in his very self, by those 2 women, because the first woman, the vulture lady, Lady von Hochberg, she stole him away so that he no longer knew who his family were, where he came from, anything about himself. And then after he died, Lord Stanhope spent 2 years in Germany traveling around organizing a campaign of slander and discrediting through the magazines and the media to say to people, this is a fool, he's a fraud, he's a swindler, he's a liar. And since that time, the struggle over the identity of this individual has been going on. And this is the question, you see, I think, that speaks to us 200 years later, in our time, the question of identity. What is our human identity? Who am I as a human being? That was Caspar's question. So, this is, I think, part of the relevance of his story and its connection to the bigger European tragedy, bigger European question. Last point from Steiner made at that same time. He said, let the kind of teaching that prevails in our universities continue for another 3 decades. Let social questions be treated as they are now for 30 years more, and you will have a devastated Europe. You can set up ideals in this field or that as much as you please. You can talk yourselves hoarse till you have no more voice about individual demands coming from one group or another, political demands, religious demands. You can talk in the belief that with such urgent demands something will be done for humanity's future. It will all be in vain unless the transformation comes from the depths of human souls, from our souls, from the thought of the relation of this world to the spiritual world, the visible world to the invisible world. If in this regard there is not a change in learning, a change in thinking, then the moral deluge, the catastrophe, will overwhelm Europe. Now, can I ask you a personal question? Could you just show with a show of hands, if you would, yeah? How many of you keep a diary? About 4 or 5. Yeah. This is interesting, because I think, you know, possibly if I'd asked that question 50 years ago, a lot more of you probably would have said yes. A second question, if you would, yeah? How many of you felt that at school, be honest, history was really boring? Oh, look at that. Look around. Yeah? You see? History is really boring. But how about our own lives? How about, yes? Yeah, fine. Good. Yeah, fine. At school, it was very boring. Later on, many people find their way to an interest in it, yeah? But many people are completely turned off from it for the rest of their lives by what happens at school. So, one of my main points I'd like to sort of get across to you today is that really, if we're trying to understand these questions about materialism, consciousness, and development, the place to start is here. Do you remember in the film that Lars showed us the other day, that clip? Very brief clip it was, where Al Pacino, it was from the film Recruit, Al Pacino was in the car talking to Brad Pitt. And Al Pacino said to Brad Pitt, in the end, he said, the only thing you can trust is what's in here. Remember that? The only thing you can go on is what's in here. But what is in here? Are we interested in our own life? Are we sufficiently interested in our own life's path? Are we sufficiently interested in what's happened, the changes in our own life? How often do we sit down with ourselves and look back at our own lives and think, what was I like when I was 10? When was the last time you did that? When was the last time, for example, have you ever tried to really look at yourself when you were 10 or 12 like you would another person? You know, almost to study yourself scientifically, objectively, and not think, oh, wasn't I cute, or wasn't I good looking, or, oh yeah, and get all sentimental or something. But just to look objectively, what was I like at that age? And what changed over the next 5, 7 years or something? What changes have I gone through? Or is life so busy for us today that we don't have the time to do that? This biographical understanding, if we really pay attention to it, if we start to look into it with interest and attention, I feel can be a really healing aspect of our modern lives, because it can help us to see there is meaning. If, for example, I had paid attention, well, fortunately I have to say in this case I did, and this is the kind of thing that happens, you see, which you can easily forget at the end of a day. On my way here, the first train I took leaving England, leaving my hometown that is, well, this free newspaper was in a train, and I just noticed somebody reading this article. And I just noticed the headline, and the headline says, "Is our identity the ultimate fiction?" I thought, wow, that's interesting, because I'm going to talk about materialism, consciousness, and development. So I picked up the paper, and read it, and it's by Sebastian Faulks, famous English novelist. His first bestseller was about the First World War. That has been the thing that got me into this whole area, my interest in the First World War, which developed in me since the age of 12. The First World War. I was born in the 20th century, like all of you, and I felt that the First World War was the key to the 20th century, and that the 20th century had come out of the First World War, and I wanted to know, what was that war? How did that happen? So here is Sebastian Faulks, and I read about his latest book, and I hear things like, the book is about whether us sophisticated humans are really anything more than a bundle of cells and what it means to be a person, a self. And then Faulks says, the principal idea in the book is how people are not really very satisfactorily distinguished from one another. We're all pretty much the same, seems to be what he's saying. I haven't read the book yet, I'm going to. It's also about how people change over the course of a life. I've been interested in this for a long time. At some point, it becomes difficult to imagine yourself as the same person you were as a child. That's interesting from him. And then later on, he says, principally, if you have been unhappy in some way, in some point in your life, it helps you understand unhappiness. But then, I think that's also true from my experience. And then later he says, knowing we are going to die makes our life a kind of mockery, a kind of joke. How is that helpful in evolutionary terms? The article says, well, he doesn't believe in God and appears, he's an atheist, as it says. Finally, it says, I like to think that a possible life, that's the name of the book, inhabits this space. I'm sharing the fact that I've understood the evidence. He means the scientific evidence. These days, if you don't know the scientific evidence, you can't be a good novelist, it seems. I'm sharing the fact that I've understood the evidence and I'm trying to make it clear to you, but I can't explain it. No one can. How does he know that no one can explain it? That takes some saying, doesn't it? No one can explain it. That's his opinion. But I don't think he can really say that no one can explain it. Anyway, it's just interesting that this is one of the ideas of one of Britain's most famous artists, novelists. Now, let's go inside a little bit into these abstract words here. Materialism, consciousness, and development. Abstract, this word, it means pull away from, draw away from. Abstract, Latin. What is drawn away? Life is drawn away. So that the word becomes shadow, a shadowy thing. Most of us today, we don't know the meaning of words. In our English language, which of course is the international language today, that's how it's worked out, our language consists of Latin-based and Germanic-based. Most English people have not studied Latin and Greek, so they don't know what most of those Latin words mean. They also don't know what most of the Germanic words mean. So we're, most of us modern people today, manipulating an abstract symbol system in our thinking life. Almost like a computer language, really. We're divorced from the actual living meaning of the words. Just look at this for a moment, if you would bear with me. The word consciousness has three parts. Con, she, well, you could say it's four parts, really. Con, she, us, ness. Conscious, of course, is an adjective. Con means with. Now, the root of this word, consciousness, is those three letters, S-C-I, she, or ski, which means, of course, know. And it's related, obviously, to the word science. Scientist is a very new word in English. It dates from the time of just after Caspar Hauser, 1830s scientist. Before that, they were called natural philosophers. And I'm sure you know, philosophy means love. Because in philosophy is love. Love of wisdom. And wisdom was a being, Sophia. It was not an abstraction. It was a woman. That's how the ancient peoples conceived of these things. Today we mock that thing. Nonsense. Today it's become a shadowy abstraction, philosophy. But it still has love in it. Science does not have love in it. Science has know in it. But if we go deeper, we find that this word know, she, S-C-I, comes from an Indo-European root, ske, which means to cut, divide. Latin scire originally meant to divide, to discern, to separate, and to distinguish one thing from another. Analysis, if you will. Yeah? You separate and you understand through separating into parts. Sanskrit, chiati, he cuts. Iranian language, a skian means a knife. We think of the 17th century, Francis Bacon, René Descartes. When the idea started to come, in order to understand nature, you have to dissect it. You have to cut it. Of course, as soon as you do that, you kill the life. You don't have a living entity anymore. There are many words like scissors, which come from this same root. Now let's listen to a few words from Richard Karash, from an online discussion he had with some other scientific academics back in the 1990s. He's talking about positivism and rationality. He says this: I will try to prove in the first place that the logic which governs our world, our organizations, and our professions, and that is mainly created by our universities, based on a technical rationality produced in the 19th century, personally I would say the 17th century, and on a mechanical positivist epistemology of science, way of thinking, study of knowledge of science, is wrong, he says, and is the main cause our civilization is failing. And on the other way, we are finding so great difficulties in creating learning organizations. He's trying to create learning organizations where scientists can work together to overcome the divisions which keep them locked into their different specialisms. And he's saying, well, our fundamental academic way of thinking, our epistemology, our way of thinking about the world is so fundamentally wrong that this is what is at the root of our problems. He says, I will not try to criticize only the universities or things that don't work very well. I will try to propose that the epistemology of science based in Descartes, where you divide a problem in parts, solve the parts, and then add the solutions, is unsystemical and fundamentally wrong. And he goes on like this. And you can see that certainly, he finishes up, saying, current universities are not only unable to solve our problems, they are part of the problem. They are the fabric of some of our main problems. Now, you can see that there's clearly some truth in that, but we can also see that even he is still thinking in that same 17th century analytical way, because he's saying, well, this is right and this is wrong. So you cut and you say wrong to that. Analysis is wrong. What we need is synthesis. Right. Yeah? So it's still the same mindset operating. Instead of seeing, at one point in European civilization, European people were thinking like this, and now we need to move into this way of thinking, so that we can imagine that there is a reason, a meaning, why at a time in history European people needed to think in that way and then move to think in another way. Just like there is a reason why you had to disagree with your parents when you were 14. There are very few of us, aren't there, who when we are teenagers get through our teenage years and we don't fight with our parents. Yeah? I'm sure most of you here had some struggles with your families when you were teenagers, yeah? I certainly did. And if you compare the consciousness of a teenager with the consciousness of a 5-year-old, these are clearly different, or of a 3-year-old. But we cannot say that the consciousness of the teenager is wrong. The consciousness of the teenager is how the teenager needs to be. That is being a teenager. There's a reason for that consciousness at that time. In that sense, it's all good. The problem comes when, like Napoleon or like Adolf Hitler, you try to retain a period of consciousness which was appropriate at one time in the past, and you try to develop it and keep it going now. Or you say, this is appropriate today. So we look at those great collective, the Nuremberg rallies, the great collectivities of the Nazis, and what they did. And we know that that is not appropriate for modern people, because we have developed over the last 2,000 years, particularly in the West, a very strong sense of the individual self. A very strong sense of the need for us to decide for ourselves on our own responsibility, our own lives. So these collectivities, which we see in forms such as fascism and communism, we know these are not appropriate. These are of the past. But in the past, they were appropriate. And we can still see various cultures around the world where, in a sense, these are still very strongly living, more or less. In my 10 years in Japan, Japan is a very interesting case, because in my 10 years in Japan, you can see the whole spectrum in many ways. Perhaps not reaching back as far as, for example, the consciousness of Aborigines in Australia, or Bushman people, or Amazonian Indians. But you can find, for example, shrines in Japan which are still used in the Shinto religion, where you have nothing there except a circle on the ground. I've been to ant shrines, shrines to the spirit of the ants in Japan, where ceremonies are still done today for the spirit of the ants. And the circle is nothing more than a sacred grove which is very, very delicately marked out, a circle where there are ants' nests, big ants' nests. Nothing built, nothing else there, no building, nothing else. And you go from that to modern, postmodernist Catholic churches all made of metal and very conceptual designs. All of that is in Japan. Everything is there. And you can see all of these different stages of consciousness within the one culture, parallel. Much more so than in Europe. So we can see that Karash has some truth in what he's saying when he points to our basic philosophical problems. And you can see that, in a sense, he's agreeing in our time with what Steiner said back in 1919, that our fundamental problem is how we think, our elites in particular, because we all go to school, and in school we learn from our teachers, and they learn from the professors in the universities who do the research. And how do they do that research? These are the cardinals of our time, the scientific cardinals of our time. How do they think? And this is the problem, Karash is saying. Now, I would now like to just speak a modern blasphemy. So you cover your ears, if you will. This is a blasphemy of the kind. We all know the word blasphemy, huh? It's when you say something bad about religion. And you probably know, well, you had that case in the cartoons here in Denmark against Mohammed, and now we've got the film from America, which is causing so much trouble. I'm now going to speak a modern blasphemy against our secular humanistic religion. It's not so strong, really, but it's simply science and shit are related. Science and shit are related. And to say that is, in fact, a scientific statement, a philological statement based on philological science. Because it's to understand the meaning of the word science. I've already told you it means to cut. But did you know that the word shit, or shite, as we used to say in English, also comes from the same root? Yeah? When you shit, you separate the unwanted material from your ear end. Yeah? It's a form of separation. Defecation, the doctors call it, using a nice Latin word. That we can do that in English, you see. But today, if you're not a doctor, the Englishman might say, cut the crap. Which means, you know, don't talk rubbish. It's interesting, isn't it, that expression, cut the crap. The crap actually is cutting, because they come from the same root. But it's a different root from the word to know and from the word to understand. Yeah? Remember, we use these words every day. We learned these words when we were little children, and we forgot it. Know comes from a completely different root. And that comes from, for example, in Scotland, they have the word ken, which means to know. Do you ken John Peel is an old Scots song, which means, do you know John Peel? Yeah? And ken, of course, comes from the Germanic kennen in German today, and that's related to können. And können means, I'm sure you know, to be able, to know how to do something. In other words, in kennen and können, you have not cutting, but you have an action. You have a willpower. Yeah? It's related to willing. So knowing and willing are related there in that word. And if you've learned a foreign language, as you have, most of you, all of you, and I have, you'll know how much effort it requires to learn a foreign language. Yeah? And that's why I'm grateful to you, because I know that you are having to work a little harder than native speakers to follow me. Yeah? When we listen to anybody who speaks a foreign language, unless we are born fluent in that language. My son is bilingual in English and Japanese, for example. So we have to work hard. Yeah? Focus, concentration, attention. Now, our very human condition divides the world, in this cutting sense, into two parts. And this knowing is the thing which overcomes this division. Because when we know something, we bring the right understanding, the right concept to that which we experience in the world. Have you ever played that game when you put your hands behind your back and somebody drops an object into your hands and you can't see it, and you're trying to figure out just by touch what is, or weight and sensation or all the other senses, yeah? But not sight. What is this? Right? And obviously the more strange the object is, the better it is to play the game. You played this game? Yeah? And if you're aware, if you pay attention, not only to the object, but what's going on inside you when you play that game, then you realize the incredible activity that is going on as you desperately search for the right concepts of balance, weight, dimension, size, whatever, yeah? Shape, function. What could it be? And then, yes, it's a... It could be, yeah. It could be, you know. Hopefully somebody wouldn't have played that particular one on you. But, you know, you get it, right? Now, imagine if when you dropped into the Amazon jungle, for example, and you managed to find one of these tribes who had never seen the modern world, as it were, and you go in there with a mobile phone, and you put a mobile phone in the hand of one of these tribesmen or tribeswomen, and how do they respond to this black, shiny object? Yeah? Well, they will have concepts for that. They might think it's a ritual object. They might think it's something to eat. They might think it's this or that. Yeah? But they will not find the concept speaking object in all probability. Yeah? It's a question of, can we find the right concept that meets this object from the sense world? And these concepts, these ideas, exist in another world, not in this sense world. And the question is to bring these two things together. And when we do that, we are knowing. So we're overcoming the division between the concepts and the percepts which we have in this world because we're human beings, physical human beings. Now, because, let's move on to the word materialism. I'm sure many of you know that this word is related to mother. Materialism, matter, mother. And here we have a really interesting thing, is it not? Yeah? Because all of us come into this physical world through the gateway, so to speak, through our mother's wombs, through our mothers. It's our mothers who materialize us. Yeah? They bring us into this physical world. And again, the ancient peoples were very conscious of this. Later on, when we had the changeover from matriarchal to patriarchal societies, many of the priests who were, of course, male had a hard time realizing that this female, this feminine element, which brought us into this physical world, that this was somehow worthy of respect, because their attention was so much on the invisible that they still considered the visible world to be not worthy. It was a lower world, so to speak, a lower realm of existence. And then we see how over the course of time, particularly in the West, until we get to the 18th century, somebody like Voltaire and the atheists of that time can reject religion altogether, reject the existence of Father God. Then in a certain sense we could say Eve has had her revenge. That the world of the male priests is over. But the question is, I think, can we really afford to reject this world of the invisible and focus only on the visible? And this is what, in a certain sense, I think we're in danger of doing and becoming overbalanced in our time. It's interesting also to observe that, for example, just as men became more and more doubtful about God and about a spiritual world, at the same time, they actually became more and more interested in being cuddled and embraced by women with big breasts. So if you look at Renaissance paintings, the women do not have big breasts. Yeah? It's only later, as we get closer to modern times, that you get the Dolly Parton syndrome and this fixation on ever bigger breasts. Yeah. This is a strange phenomenon. So on the one hand, you have or interesting phenomenon, I should say. You have the rejection of the father realm, you might say, and the doubt, the atheism, the agnosticism, the focus only on the world of the five senses, and then at the same time you see how there's this focus on a particular form of the female body. Richard Dawkins, I don't know if you've heard of him in Denmark, yeah? Richard Dawkins is a well-known scientist in Britain, biologist, and these days, in the last 10 years or so, he's become more famous for attacking religion. So he travels around the world attacking religion and basically saying, well, the values of natural science are those which are all important. The values particularly of the Enlightenment, the late 18th century. That was the time, if you remember, that all fashionable people in Europe walked around, whether they were 20 or whether they were 60, they all walked around with white heads. The rich ones. They wore white powdered wigs. People who were 20 wore white powdered wigs. You can think about that, yeah? The Enlightenment. Because rationality had become so important over those 200 years. Intellectual thought. Anyway, Dawkins, he places his values in that period. And many other major public figures in the Anglo-American world see today the Enlightenment of the late 18th century. They look to the 18th century as a period of real importance for European civilization, something that we can all rally round. Let's all gather round the flag, so to speak. Yeah? These are our tribal values, the values of the Enlightenment. And then in America, you see somebody like Ron Paul, the presidential candidate. He looks back to the 18th century and American constitutionalism. Or you see The Economist, which I mentioned earlier, which bases itself and the Anglo-Saxon view of capitalism on the 18th century ideas of Adam Smith. Developed, of course, and metamorphosed a little, but basically the same ideas. Or in Britain, we have a very strong political party system, and the political party system also developed in the late 18th century. So we see this late 18th century period, very key, very important period in historical evolution, and many people still identify with it, including some of our leading minds. And so Richard Dawkins and others like him often condemn or dismiss all European cultures before the 18th century in the way they looked at the world as childish nonsense. The medieval world, people like Voltaire, it was fashionable in that time, in the 18th century, to look at the medieval world and say, that's all childish nonsense. We are superior to that. So in the 18th century, that was the time when we began in the West to reject our past, do you see? It's a bit like when you become 18, you get through puberty, wow, no more stress. The hormones are not charging so much anymore. You've got a bit of a relief now. You're starting to look forward to breaking away from your parents, maybe going to university, getting a job, getting your first house, and so on. And you don't want to think about puberty, and you certainly don't want to think about childhood anymore. All of that falls away for the young person aged 17 and 18. There may be a few who still think about their childhood, but most young people are no longer interested in their childhood. They're no longer interested in the consciousness of a child. So something very special happened there. In the 18th century, we have a culture, our Western culture, which rejects its past. That did not happen in Asia, for example. So I remember I met two Christian fundamentalist missionaries in the 1980s. As communism was coming to an end, they were planning to go to Albania to spread the word of God there. And I asked them, so what do you think about the religions of Asia? And without blinking an eye, they immediately said, they're all of the devil. Yeah? They're all of the devil. No interest, no attention. All of that before Christ is of no interest and is all of the devil. Richard Dawkins, all childish nonsense. There is no sense in thinking or understanding for him that maybe that was right at one time, and then this is right at another time, and then something is right at another time, that each phase of development is appropriate. And we should honor and respect each phase of development, even in its so-called errors. And heaven knows that we're making enough right now in our wonderful scientific, technological civilization of financial crisis, economic crisis, pollution crisis, money crisis, geopolitical crisis, religious crisis, and all the other crises we have, which are caused by, not least, our elite people who have all been trained and educated at university with degrees and letters after their name and so on and so forth. Yeah? All of this mess. And then somebody like Dawkins can stand there and say, they were all childish nonsense. Nothing to learn from them. So, I think this for me is an important element that we need to really pay attention to these previous times, not only out of just an interest, a kind of hobby interest or something like that, but to realize that we're looking at an evolving consciousness, the evolving story of humanity. And I know sometimes you see those words used, but I don't think it's really meant thoroughly in a certain way, yeah? And a really important clue for us here, something that helps us, is your own life. To pay attention to your own life when you were 6 and 7, at the time of the changing of your teeth, which is when your life forces began to separate from those of your mother. And then again, what happened in your life around the ages of 9 and 10? Did you start to have feelings like, are they really my parents? Can you remember things like that? The beginnings of doubt. Just a small inkling, a small beginning. Or at the age of, say, around about 14, 12, 14, the beginnings of puberty. How did you go through puberty? How did your mind change? How did your thinking, your feeling change? To really look at that. And then the more subtle changes that take place after 21. I'm now 60, so I have a lot to think about. And some of you, I can see, have even more to think about than me. Yeah? But this is our story, and nobody knows it better than us. Nobody is in a better situation to be a scientist of this story than we are ourselves. And if we can start to link the changes in our own soul development, in our own consciousness, and try to see, well, what happens in history? And here I'd like to suggest something. I don't have time to develop this in detail now, but I'd just like to put this forward to you as a, if you like, a scientific hypothesis for you to investigate for yourself in relation to your own life and in relation to your own understanding of history. And that is, please, look back over the last 2,000 years. Just start with the West, because I'm sure that's, for most of you, that's the place you probably know most about. And look at some certain key points in the history of the West. Look at things which took place at certain centuries. And I would suggest look particularly at times like the 6th and 7th century, the 13th and 14th century, those periods. Look at what happens in religious life, spiritual life. Look what happens in political life. And look what happens in economic life. Look at key developments which are going on at that time. And try to notice what sort of changes take place. Let me just point to a couple of things. There are three events in the history of the church which we need to know about and which most people don't know about. Well, I'll correct myself. Most people are aware of the first one. I'm referring to the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, Constantine. He was the one, as you know, the Council of Nicaea. What do you say in Danish? Nicaea? Yeah? That was the council where the Emperor Constantine, there was a struggle going on inside the church, and he wanted a unified church, one religion, one empire, one people. Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer. That's what he wanted. Now remember, it wasn't wrong then, in a certain sense. It wasn't as wrong then as it is in 1933. But nevertheless, it had a very negative effect on the development of the Christian faith. So that was the beginning of the Roman spirit invading the Christian religion. So the Christian religion becomes increasingly bound up with the spirit of the Roman Empire. Yeah? The next date, another man rather like Constantine, the Emperor Justinian. He's the emperor who built the church of Hagia Sophia. Maybe some of you have been there in Constantinople, Istanbul. And this amazing round building, which he wished to symbolize again, one empire, one religion, one emperor, one people, all united. And the council there was 553 is the date. And in that council, a certain individual was anathematized. I hope you know what that word means. It means an individual's ideas are declared to be out of order, and you are not allowed to read this person, you're not allowed to discuss him, you're not allowed to think in this way. This person is outside the community of the church, persona non grata. This person is anathema. Yeah? And that person was Origen, the early church father. And why? Well, he, according to the church at the time, he had various philosophical sins, but one of those important philosophical sins was he was very interested in the idea that we have more than one life. We have more than one life. And there you see the beginning in European culture. Not the very beginning, because it already really sort of started a little bit earlier, yeah? But really where it's laid down, thou shalt not believe that we have more than one life. Now we know that the Celtic peoples across Europe entertained this idea. That was a reality for them, that we have more than one life. So we know that this idea existed in the West. But from that time on, it gradually faded away because we were not allowed by the spiritual, the thought police of the time. It's not really right to use that expression. Perhaps it's a bit colorful, but because it's too 20th century. I mean the people who controlled thinking. the shepherds of the flock, the priests, yeah? And remember, they were trying to maintain order in a very chaotic period of history. That's what the Roman Empire had done, and that's what the Roman Catholic Church also tried to do, to maintain order. Villages and towns grew up around churches. It was not totally wrong, and we shouldn't think it was. There was a place for that, but inevitably these things go too far. Inevitably a spirit of complete inhumanity and unfreedom comes in when you try to make everybody think in the same way. So that was the second thing, second church council. The third one is even more unknown, and that's the year 869, 9th century, 869. And there, in Constantinople again, this is the 8th council of the church, Constantinople, 869. Another man was anathematized, another churchman was anathematized. His name was Photius. He was a patriarch of the Eastern church in Constantinople. And he was very interested in the idea that we have two souls. Two souls. We have a soul which is focused on the physical world, and we have a soul which is focused on the spiritual world. We have this in English, a little bit, still a vague memory of this. For example, we can say, I feel hungry, feel. I feel hungry. The soul is reflecting something from the body. I feel sad, I feel happy. The soul is reflecting something in the feeling life, purely. I feel that's not right. The soul is reflecting something in the discerning mental capacity, making a moral intuition, a moral sense. So the soul has this capacity to work in different ways. And the church said, you have only one soul. You do not have two souls. And by doing that, by declaring the teaching of two souls to be anathema, that was the final separation in the West. Because it meant that you do not have a soul as an individual which can then find its own way to the spiritual world, to God. You must depend on the church and on the dogmas of the church. You must accept that. If you do not, you will be out of the society, or you will be put to death in the worst case. Yeah? Now, these are councils of the church which carried out these doctrines. Specifically, by the way, if you're interested in the last one, you should look at the 11th canon. The canon means the decree of the church, which proclaims the anathema. Yeah? The 11th canon of the Council of Constantinople, 869. Now, just as a little interesting thing, because I'm quite interested in numbers and dates, and I know probably everybody hates dates at school, yeah? But dates can be very interesting. 869, add those three dates up, it comes to 23. Now, when I was in my 30s, in the 1980s, I became very interested in this number 23. And I started noticing that this number is in many, many special places, particularly in the history of the English-speaking peoples, particularly in the history of my own people. I think Skanderborg was the birthplace of Anne of Denmark. Is that not right? Anybody know that? Local historians here? The birthplace of Anne of Denmark. Anne of Denmark married King James VI of Scotland, who became King James I of England, one of the most important English kings. This was the king who was the patron of Bacon and the patron of Shakespeare. King James came over to Denmark to pick Anne up and take her back to England with him. He was 23 when he did that, in the 23rd year of his reign. King James was the 23rd king of England since the Norman conquest. The Normans, of course, were Danes with a little bit of French culture who spoke French. But most of them were from here. They'd only been living in France 150 years. They were Vikings, in effect, powerful, willful people. And anyway, from that time, 1066, when England was invaded, that's a very important date in our history, King James was the 23rd monarch. And then you'll find that this number 23 is in very special places in William Shakespeare's plays. And you'll also find that the psalm, you know the psalms from the Old Testament? How do you say that in Danish? Psalm? Sorry? Salmo? Yeah? In the Old Testament. The most important psalm in the history of the English-speaking people has always been the 23rd Psalm, whether it's Britain or America or wherever. And that in the language of the King James Bible, published 1611, the reign of James I, who was the first king who put the English colonies in America, who was also, in his reign, the first English factories in India. Yeah? This is a very special time in the history of England. Anyway, I just want to draw your attention to this number 23. When I go to Japan, and you take a photograph in Japan, everybody, all the young people, they all do this. Yeah? Everybody does that. Young people in particular, right? What is this? Yeah, we think it's V for victory. Where does it come from? Oh, interesting. Good. There are the two explanations right there. Churchill and the archers. The English archers fighting the French. When the French came, the English said, "Fuck you," which means we're going to kill you. They did this to make the French afraid of them. But this way round, yeah, not this way round. That, in other words, we're going to give you the arrow. Sorry? The taxi drivers. Yeah. But you notice, just interestingly, yeah, that people all over the world doing this, 2/3. That's what you're looking at. If you go to Serbia, they do this. 3/2, right? And if I stand here as a human being, and I meant to make a pentagram, this is the right way up for me to be as a human being. 3/2. You turn me upside down, I'm something else. Yeah? And that pentagram, as I'm sure some of you know, also in the course of European history, signifies something else, something rather less pleasant. Yeah? The question is, what kind of being are we? Are we a twofold being? Is it 2 on top and 3 somewhere down under the earth? Are our heads in the ground? Football. A great English export. And what do you do with this game? You kick a ball which is the size of a head. And you use your head as a limb. I don't mean to criticize football, because in many respects, football, again, like I said before, it's a direct reflection of where our culture is in this point in time. Yeah? It's a direct reflection that our heads are in the earth. Our heads are in the 5 sense reality. Our heads are not open to the spirit and to the stars yet, like they were in the old days. Our attention is down there into the world of the senses. And so it's not surprising that a culture like mine, where the Industrial Revolution began, the English did not develop the scientific revolution, the commercial revolution, the agricultural revolution. These came from other places. But the Industrial Revolution, that came from England. As I said, 1 hour from where I live. That came from England. We took minerals out of the earth, turned them into machines, added steam to them, and created another layer of reality which had never been there in human history before. Machine culture. And we know where that's going. We know that when the church said in 869, you are not a threefold being of body, soul, and spirit. You are a twofold being. You are a dichotomy. You are not a trichotomy. You are a dichotomy. You are only body and soul. You're not body, soul, and spirit. Yeah? The animals also have souls. So you are, a little bit later, we get the logic which says you're an animal. We're no different from the animals at all. Many people think that today. Because long time ago, which we've forgotten about, almost all of us, the church took a certain decision. And that decision had momentous, huge, enormous consequences for European civilization. And this is what I'm saying about the diary, do you see? That if you are the chronicler of your own history, and you see what has happened, when I was 8, my mother introduced me, took me to that group, or the arts group, and I was painting in that group, and I met her, and then I met, and from him I learned how to, and then you realize how you're connected to people. You realize that your life hasn't been completely meaningless. You begin to see the pattern in your own biography. But we've forgotten so much of that because history was so damn boring at school, so most of us are not interested in it anymore. So, and we don't know what the church did at these particular points to change our minds. Now again, please, I do want to emphasize this. Of course you can say this is a form of mind control. But I don't want to get into this cutting and say that's bad and that's good. I want to say rather, this was a stage of our development in which good and bad were both involved. And then another stage comes, and then another stage comes. So I've told you about the three councils. Let me just come up to the puberty time, 14th century. I call this the Western civilization's fall into puberty. And actually, it's not only Western civilization. I could give you many examples from Japanese history too. This is important, to look at the history of other cultures and see whether this also holds true for them. That in the 14th century, what we call the 14th century, in a certain time, there was a kind of a fall into puberty. And that happens in our individual lives. Around this time, we stop skipping. Why do we stop skipping? Have you ever asked yourself that question, yeah? You used to skip. Skip, you know. Right? Children skip because children live in lightness. But at some point, we lose that. It's not just a physical thing. And then you get a teenager. Right, left, yeah? Trying to find the center, but not finding it yet. Am I in my peer group? Am I out of my peer group? One foot in the group, one foot wanting to get out of the group, wanting to stand on your own 2 feet, but you don't yet. This kind of thing. This is the Middle Ages. You look at European culture from this perspective. Look what happens in the 14th century. The 14th century was preceded by 200 years of a great philosophical battle. I'm not going to go into it, it's very complicated. Some of you may know about it. The struggle between the nominalists and the realists in the universities and churches of Europe. And they were arguing about what is the nature of knowledge. And the knowledge and the universe, basically, very basically, if I put it very simply, the nominalists argued the ideas do not exist for themselves. There is no such thing as redness. There are only red objects. So there is no abstract form somewhere which exists, no idea, something like Plato had. A world of forms, a world of ideas which exist in some sort of spiritual world. There's nothing like that. There are only objects. And we just happen to put labels on these objects. It wouldn't matter whether I call this a bottle or a or a bubak or a whatever. Yeah, it's just a label. It doesn't mean anything. I could just as well call it a 125A64. Yeah? This kind of thinking, which was a mental reflection of the gradual sinking of our Western culture down into real connection eventually with the mineral world, which would lead to the Industrial Revolution, where our interest and our focus is on the mineral world more than the living, biological, dynamic world. And then something else happened at that time, the Black Death. The Black Death came to Europe and killed about a third, I think is the generally understood. There's some arguments about it, but it killed an awful lot of people right across Europe. And that created fear in the souls. It created insecurity. It created a preoccupation with death. And we see the Totentanz, the dance of death, beginning to emerge around Europe. We see melancholy start to appear in art and in music. We see all kinds of artistic changes which reflect this concentration, this fear of death. And this goes through the 15th century. And it prepares us then for what eventually comes out in the 17th century, which is a science, the development of a science which is based essentially on the observation of the mineral world, the world which does not have life, the biological. Yeah. And then the application of the thought forms from that mineral world to all the other forms of life. So the application of science in the mineral world, the thinking that is appropriate in that to understand that world is then applied to biology and is then applied to the human sciences. And this is a big mistake which we made. Understandable, but it's a big mistake, and this is what we're trying now to turn around very slowly and with much difficulty. But this is a long process, as you can see. I must come towards an end, so there's some time for questions, because I think I have to finish in 15 minutes. The London Olympics, let me just come back to them. I think we can see that in the London Olympics, a picture was put forward to the world of what Britain stands for, of what British culture stands for, or English-speaking culture stands for in the world. And this culture, there was one moment in the ceremony where the word freedom was spread all around the stadium, as if to suggest that English culture is the culture of freedom. And then the song was put forward, the song from the 1970s band Queen called We Will Rock You. Remember that? Any Queen fans here, perhaps, yes? The 1970s, right? Meaning, we, the English-speaking world, will rock you. Of course, you can say, well, Queen meant we, Queen, will rock you, the fans. Well, yes, but in a context of the Olympics, and if you look at everything else which happened in the Olympics, they're really saying, we, the English people, the English-speaking peoples, are the people who represent freedom and individuality and creativity and choice and all these things which the Chinese in Beijing in 2008 do not represent. That contrast was always there, right? And that was deliberately done because we are being prepared in many ways for the war, for the struggle, for the strife, for the conflict which is coming with China later on in this century, and which America is now preparing for by containing China and creating all these bases around China and making all these arrangements with countries around China so it can position itself for this coming conflict with China. This is a very sick scenario which is being prepared, and you can see this is being prepared in countless ways by looking at the American think tanks' publications. I would suggest, for example, Foreign Affairs as a starting place, the magazine of the Council on Foreign Relations. Anyway, there was the contrast all the time between these two ways of thinking. But the question is, what kind of freedom does this British culture stand for? Is the British freedom the same as the German Freiheit? Or I understand in Danish you say frihed, is that right? Frihed? Yeah, that's very interesting. I heard this the other day, and of course you write it H-E-D, don't you? But you change that D very much into a completely different sound almost, right? You don't say frihed, right? Like brotherhood in English, which is related to that, yeah? Headhood, had. Yeah. So how are the Germanic people who use this, Freiheit, experiencing freedom, and how are the English experiencing freedom? If you look into that, it's very interesting to see what this dom is, this old tuom, this Germanic root, yeah, which is actually related to the old word for law and judgment and condemnation, which comes to you from the outside. It's something which is very related even to the word, yes? To, yeah, exactly. It's something which comes to you from the outside, yeah? And the English concept of freedom is something which means I want to be free from external limit, external restraint. And it's very different from a German concept of freedom, for example. I'm sorry, I can't speak about this, the nuance of the Danish word there, yeah? Maybe that's a bit different from the German, because the sound is certainly very different. But in the German Freiheit, if you look into the concept of freedom in German history and how this has been presented, you'll see it's a much more inner experience. I'm very grateful to Lars again, if you remember. He showed us that song, Die Gedanken sind frei. Remember that? And when he said that comes from an old German folk song, I thought, absolutely. There you see that it's really to do with what is happening in your mind, the creation of thoughts. So that even in prison, as long as you're not brainwashed, you can be free. As long as you're able to bring the concept and percept together for yourself. It does not matter whether your hands are bound. Yeah? You are still essentially free. And only radical brainwashing will take that away from you. So it's a very different gesture, the outer English approach to freedom and the inner German approach to freedom. So I'd like to finish really by, again, recommending to you that if we want to understand how materialism has developed to this point in European culture, that we look back, first of all, at that thing which we know best, which is our own life. Because when we look in our own life, not only our personal life in our memories and what we have done in our life, but also look at what you are as a human being. What particular, take me for example, yeah? Seeing as I'm up here, almost all my physical problems in my life have been on the left side of my body, not the right. When did that begin? How did that begin? Why did that begin? Now, we can go back quite a long way. But I would suggest to early childhood, and doctors try to do that, psychiatrists try to do that, to go back as far as they can, perhaps even into the mother's womb. But I would remind you again of what happened in 869, yeah? And 553. That at that time, reincarnation was cut out of Western culture. And we know very well that when Western culture and Buddhism Western culture started to rediscover, or discover, perhaps I should say, Buddhism, around about 1800, round about the time of Caspar Hauser. This is when the main Buddhist texts were first being translated into European languages. You see that it's from this time that reincarnation and karma, these ideas, the idea we have more than one life, starts to come back into Western consciousness. So a certain period of time, which in a certain sense had to be closed for a while, is now open again. Now, what effect will that have if we begin to scientifically study it? And a beginning has been made in the scientific studies of reincarnation. I would recommend to you the work of Dr. Ian Stevenson, for example. He died just a couple of years ago, American. Stevenson, Stephen with a V. Dr. Ian Stevenson, you find things about him on YouTube as well and online. He did a lot of research with children who could remember their previous lives in India and other countries, yeah? And published a book about that. Thorough scientific research, careful observation. And it's this kind of thing where, what is the name of our conference? Open mind. Where if scientists can start to become open and realize that their own thinking, their own scientific thinking is itself controlled by their own culture and their own habits, then they can start not to dogmatically say, no, we're not going to investigate that. We're not going to investigate what happens before birth or after death. We only focus on between birth and death. I think we're starting to realize as a culture that many of our psychological, physical problems, we will only ultimately realize that these are problems eventually of destiny. And that will go back before the present life. But we have to start studying this. And you can find on YouTube that certain children are beginning to come forward in the West now with memories of their previous lives. You've got to be very careful. You've got to be very careful that their parents are not exploiting them, putting them forward to make money or something like this, yeah? And you've got to be careful in a scientific way. You've got to be exact, you've got to be precise, you've got to ask the right questions. But it is happening. Some remarkable things are happening. Again, you can find some very interesting cases of that on YouTube. So these things are beginning to challenge our scientific paradigm and extend our consciousness before birth and after death. In the West, because of the Christian church, we've often thought about life after death. If I'm a good boy, I go upstairs. If I'm a bad boy, I go downstairs. But we haven't thought about before birth. Asia has always thought about that. And now we are starting to think about it too. But we need to think about it in a modern way. That means we need to think about it in a way which incorporates and includes our natural scientific development over the last 300 years. We should not immediately reject all of that and say, like Karash, that's bad. So now we will start to go into a trance, and now we will go take drugs, and now we will go back, try and go back into, very ancient ways, which we don't really understand anymore because they don't have a general holistic context around them. Sorry, did you catch that? Yeah? We take bits of things. We say we're interested in holistic this and holistic that, and then we take a bit of this ancient culture and a bit of that ancient, a bit of this and a bit of the other, yeah? And we put it together and we say, this is my reality. But those spiritual practices belonged in a cultural whole with a W, yeah? So we need to look at something like reincarnation, the scientific study of reincarnation, in a way which does not reject our heritage from the past 300 years and incorporates the best of that, which means careful, dispassionate, accurate observation. So this is happening, and I think this is really very valuable for the future, and something that will help to bring us out of the problems which we've been discussing so much in the conference, the problems which come, I believe, from our sinking too far now into materialism, much too far. And we need to realize it's no help to go back to the 18th century, because that's teenage consciousness. That is adolescent consciousness. And we're in the 21st century now. We need to move on beyond adolescence. We need to take real responsibility like a 21-year-old does, and stands in the world without all the old authorities, without all the old groups, and takes responsibility for the planet, and takes responsibility for our lives. This is what a 21-year-old does. This is what the 21st century human beings, I think, we are seeking to do, struggling to do. But we're being held back in a certain sense, not only by these dangerous elites, and certainly they're working overtime. I'm sure Ian will tell us more about that tonight. But also by those forces in ourselves which want to hang back in these earlier periods. Yeah? And so that requires careful observation within. Hence, I would say, the importance of interest and attention to our own life path. So with that, I'll stop. And thank you very much for your patience and understanding. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Terry.
Thank you.
Any questions?
It's just the detail. Why exactly are the Japanese young people doing like this?
The question was, why do the Japanese young people do this? It's not a detail, it's quite a profound question, actually. It goes to, if I try and make it very quick, yeah? Kata. kata. Remember this word kata. It's a Japanese word, kata, and it means form. And it means that there is a correct, perfect, and beautiful way to do everything. One of the things that really impressed me when I was in Japan for the first time was that the Japanese, in their higher culture, so to speak, they try to do everything beautifully. It's the most aesthetic culture on the planet, right? And so they try to be perfect. They try to do everything in a real form, which is beautiful and harmonious. And that applies to everything they do, even Hell's Angels. In Denmark and America and Britain, Hell's Angels will piss on their clothes, or used to. I don't know about in Denmark these days. But, you know, you wore the dirtiest, the crudest, yeah? In Japan, impossible. If you're a Hell's Angel in Japan, you will look beautiful. You will look like a fashion model. So even the Hell's Angels are beautiful in Japan, right? So even these modern Western things, they want to do beautifully and they want to do right. And somehow they believe that this is the right thing which must be done when you take a photograph. Just as there was a traditional way for sitting, so in Japan no male sat like this, every male would sit like this. Yeah? So similarly, when you take a photograph, the right way to take a photograph is to accompany your gesture with this, if you are a young person. It's to do with this concern for form. Kata is the form. Oh, kata is absolutely, yeah, exactly the same word, yeah. In kata, you start by practicing the kata. And the kata are the basic forms of karate, and all of the martial arts have these basic forms, yeah. And then later, they become looser and more individual. Sorry. That, I haven't thought, you know, I mean, I thought of that, but I don't know the linguistic connection. That's very interesting. Thank you for reminding me to look into that. Yeah, because of course it means purity, yes. Yes, purity of form, perhaps. At a deep linguistic level, yeah?
Hello. I have a question to you. But first of all, Terry, thank you for a very great lecture.
Thank you.
And thank you for raising the bar for this conference. Thank you for not pointing fingers of others. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about the third parting of the society?
The third?
What is you call it? Tredeling. Division. Division into three of the society.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. Of course, right. So there was the abolition of the spirit, as I meant, right? You have no spirit, as the church said. And then with psychology, the development of Western psychology, gradually we were increasingly told, well, the human mind, the soul, psychology, psyche, psyche, was again a goddess, a feminine being in the ancient Greek culture, right? So you have no soul because it's all biochemical, electrical operations going on inside this physical brain. Yeah? So once we have studied that, somebody like Daniel Dennett, the American neuroscientist, he's not interested in consciousness at all. He says this is no issue. Yeah? There is no consciousness in this sense of having a spirit or a soul. Once we have described the electrobiological, biochemical reactions going on in the brain, we will be able to describe these, and then we'll be able to predict them, and then we'll be able to control them. We've already heard things about this in our conference, yeah? So that was the second one, which followed on from if you could say that's the abolition of the soul. The third one is the abolition of the body. And that's happening through the transhumanists. I'm sorry, I forgot them. Thanks for reminding me. The transhumanists, yeah? You're familiar with that? Ray Kurzweil. These are the people who are looking forward enthusiastically within 100 years to the end of biological humanity. That our so-called consciousness, or, well, it won't actually exist, yeah? Our intelligence will be in some form attached, connected to some vehicle which is not biological, but is perhaps ceramic or mechanical, mineral, or some other form. Some form of robotic entity. And this was regarded as the next stage in evolution. This is the transhumanist movement. Please do, yes, check that out online. It's the abolition of the human body, in effect. Ray Kurzweil, Weil with a W, very important person to look into there. He gives a breakdown of what he thinks will happen in the next decades of this century where this process will take place. So he's saying, well, perhaps by 2040, human intelligence simply will not be able to function, will not be able to cope, because computer intelligence will have developed to such a point that we simply, we'll be out of it. So we have to give over, in a sense, to the machine culture which is coming. And they're looking forward to that. Yes, there was a question at the back. Sorry? Oh, the microphone, yeah. And then there was a gentleman at the back over there.
Sorry, I would just like to ask you what the name of the book was. Abolition?
No, the book that written by Ray, well, he's written two books, two very big books on this subject. The one the first one, 1999, The Age of Spiritual Machines. And the second one is The Singularity, oh, hang on a second, help me out, can anybody know this one? The Singularity is Near, 2005. The singularity, that's this point where, as I said, computer intelligence will have got to this point where things are moving so fast that we, with our human minds, human brains, cannot cope, cannot manage. Yeah.
I got a question. In your opinion, you say we are developing, and yes, we are, but what's the ultimate goal of this developing in the way you see it?
Right. I think to try and put it as succinctly as I can, I think that if I take an example from literature, right? 19th century, there was an interesting English novelist, a very interesting man, worth looking into. His name was Bulwer Lytton. Bulwer, B-U-L-W-E-R, hyphen, I can write that down for you later, hyphen L-Y-T-T-O-N. Bulwer Lytton. He was an aristocrat. He was also an esotericist and an occultist. And he wrote a book called Zanoni. Maybe some of you know it. And in this book, Zanoni, he described the relationship between an occult teacher of a very traditional kind, conservative kind, and a young pupil who wanted to learn the occult secrets. And to answer your question, the basic difference between these two guys was that the older man, Mejnour was his name, he believed that the secrets of knowledge must be kept secret from the people, from those who do not know, yeah? From the ones who are not, as it were, educated in them. They must be kept secret. Whereas the young man, Glyndon, he wanted to make these secrets, he felt that this should be out there. Sorry, I can't quite hear you. Externalization of the hierarchy. Well, I'm not quite sure how you're seeing that. I mean, the way I see, frankly, where I see Alice Bailey is that there you have a mysterious Tibetan who you don't know where he's coming from or what he's about, and then communications are being given to this woman. I don't see that as something which is essentially modern and going into the future. That's my honest opinion, yeah? That's how I would make that comparison, right? But whenever, I mean, Ian mentioned this the other day, yesterday, with the pyramid, that the powers that be, the traditional powers that be, and this is why, you see, if you're interested in David Rockefeller, for example, and you ask, well, who is David Rockefeller? What is working in the will of an individual like that? Either you can say he's not a human being, and that he's masquerading. That's what somebody like David Icke would say. He's a reptile in disguise, yeah? Or somebody else might say he's an alien from another planet in disguise. Personally, I don't think that. Personally, I would be more interested in what I said to you now, to scientifically begin to study reincarnation so that we can start to, with sympathy, with interest, look into the lives of other human beings and see what is working through them. See what comes from previous lives, maybe metamorphosed, and works on in this life in some way. So when you're looking at a great captain of industry, or a great president of a company or something like that, and you see what qualities live in this woman or this man, and can we sense what gestures are coming forward in this person, which may have been coming from a previous life, yeah? Rather than thinking it's from out there again, from another galaxy or from a reptile or something like this, yes? Something which is, again, human, but has somehow transformed. Sometimes in a positive way, sometimes not. Yeah? So, does that answer your question?
No, but what was the main goal, the ultimate?
Oh yeah, right. So the ultimate goal then is that the Mejnour wanted to, he was interested only in wisdom, do you see? He was interested only in knowledge. So his attitude towards those who did not have knowledge was basic, well, they are the sheep. They are the unwashed. They are the unworthy. He had no love. He did not have those words of St. Paul in the Bible. Yeah? If I have this, and 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 if I have not love, I am nothing. So it's the transformation, and here's the answer to your question. It's the transformation of wisdom into love. And that's not easy. Yeah? And there are some people who carry these impulses from the past. Maybe they were ancient mystery centers. Maybe they were ancient priests of the church. Maybe they were ancient other kinds of kings or whatever, from something from the past, yeah? But they believe that knowledge is not to be given out. Fundamental anti-democratic attitude which does not respect that all of us in the modern age are seeking to find ourselves as individuals. And that we all, I won't speak of rights, because frankly that's the realm of the law, and I'm not so interested in that, yeah? That's also from the past. But rather, as a fact of spiritual development, we are all now, as I see it, striving to find out who we are. This is the identity question. And so this has to do with love, interest and attention in the other person or the other culture. Yeah? And so that's I think, what it's all about. Transforming our planet and our humanity into something which is just a body of wisdom, and it's wonderfully wise, nature and the world and the human organism and everything else, but moving the human being's attention from wisdom into love. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Cheers.
One last question.
It's more of a comment. You were talking about breasts,
yeah,
and the fixation of these big breasts. And there's an interesting connection to the tantric tradition, because they see an energy circle going in here and coming out from the breast. And also when you see all the goddesses, the ancient goddesses, before we went into patriarchy, you also see the breast, and it's like nurture to all the people. And the astrological interested persons, they say we also have a emerging of the goddess, or she will come back, or, you know.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of, that was just interesting. Fine. Breasts.
Yeah, breasts, indeed. But again, I would say, you know, breasts in some parts of the world are not necessarily the same as breasts in another part of the world. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Terry.
Thanks, Mace.
And,
cheers. And thank you all, and thank you to the organisers. Thank you very much.